started reading Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, and it's my first real opportunity reading any of his books. I'm familiar with him. I've watched some videos on his philosophies and heard people speak about him, and I'm sure I've learned about him in school to some extent. But first time I'm directly reading his books. And I'm only maybe about a quarter of the way through, if that, of Beyond Good and Evil. So just really through the first two chapters. So around the prejudice of philosophers and then free will. And I guess my initial thoughts on reading Nietzsche are it's a difficult book to read. It's not really for me, it's not really an enjoyable book to read. And by enjoyable, I don't mean, some like lighthearted novel that you could skim through and kind of read in a day. I mean enjoyable in that it's allows you to identify clear value from the book, I guess is how I'll say it. I read lots of different types of books. Sometimes I read history books. Sometimes I read psychology, cognitive psychology, all different books. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's the right gauge, but that ability to feel like, hey, I'm reading this and I feel like it's valuable input that I'm taking in. Doesn't mean that I blindly follow whatever they say. It doesn't mean that I just adopt, those beliefs or views. Sometimes I disagree with them strongly, but just the act of reading it, I feel like is improving me. Nietzsche, at least thus far, is not like that. Now, maybe that's part of the genius of him, and that's part of the value of him, is that it's so deep, it's so complex, it's open to interpretation so much that it doesn't make the value apparent right away. And that's possible, and I've certainly heard enough people speak that seem to believe that. But it brings me to this Jay-Z quote, as I put in the title of the video. Just because you don't understand what he's saying doesn't mean that he's nice. Meaning just because it's hard to interpret and understand, given the way Nietzsche writes and what he writes about, just because it seems complex, just because it seems really hard to get your arms around and identify exactly what he's saying, that doesn't mean it's deep and profound. It may very well be, right? There's lots of evidence, I think, that I've heard anecdotally that suggests, how intelligent he was and how advanced his intellect was. And certainly within his writings, you see some deep level thinking in there. But most people that I've listened to or read that are credible and reasonable that speak about Nietzsche, there's a few things they acknowledge. I mean, one, again, it's his writings are very much up for interpretation. You don't know exactly what he's saying. There's a lot of assumptions made in what you think he meant or how he meant it or why he meant it. You pair that with the fact that he lost his mind after writing a number of books, in a pretty short period. There's like a very utilitarian view of that too, of like, well, how valuable could it be? How useful could it be if, in theory, his writings were meant to improve humans, right? It's a philosophical writing where if you read it and you understand his philosophies and his beliefs, in theory, and he wrote a lot about this, you should become a higher level human. But if for him it destroyed him, it calls that into question a little bit. Again, I don't say these things to say with any certainty to dismiss him. I say it to just say, hey, we should call a spade and be objective in how we assess him. And it seems as if, which I guess the third point that a lot of people acknowledge is, Nietzsche's views tend to be, I've heard some say is like anti-establishment. I don't know that I necessarily go that far, at least from what I've read thus far, but it's a very challenging writing style. By that I mean he challenges norms, he challenges commonly held beliefs, he challenges base assumptions about how we think, how we speak, how we formulate ideas, how our psyche works. He challenges all of that down to the base level. And that's an interesting approach. I think it's a valuable approach. And, who's to say if it's the right approach or the wrong approach when it comes to prioritizing philosophies. But it's an interesting approach because for someone that was going to take it superficially, or someone that was looking to latch on to a certain type of philosophy or philosopher and say they've got it right, the style of someone who points out the flaws in everything else and questions everything and says, none of it really makes sense. How do you know that's actually true? And how do you know that, the words you're using aren't changing the meaning of this, and that your whole perspective is off? That's a very easy style to buy into, and it's very hard to dispute, right? When you take a stand and say, I believe this, right, you need to defend it. You need to prove it out as best you can. And it's easy to dispute. It gets back to Occam's razor a little bit, as we've spoken about. The beauty of that is you test the thing that's easiest to prove or disprove first, because that's what you want to do from a scientific perspective. A philosophy that's built on saying, I think that is wrong, or I don't think that's right, or I don't think that's the whole picture, it becomes difficult to disprove that. And I think for those reasons, you get a bit of a cult following around Nietzsche, where people believe, much like I said in the beginning, that because they don't fully understand it, because it's the style of it, the nature of it, etc., everything I just said, there's an overweighting of the value and the impact and the profoundness of it. And I find myself, as I'm reading it, just trying to be careful to not dig into that too much, right? To try and stay objective, as you always would. So, curious to see as I keep reading the book. And I definitely do see some of the themes, right? I do see the ideas of his issue with philosophers and other folks is that it's all built on this premise that what we see, what we perceive, how we think, how we've always thought is a basic framework of how to view life and how to view truth and how to view all these different things, values, morality, etc. But he's saying, how do we even know that's right? And I think that's a fantastic question. I think it's a great one to tackle, but you just have to treat it, I think, with the appropriate approach and mentality. You can't get lost in the idea that nothing is nothing, and we don't really have any base to go off of. And again, being a quarter of the way through the book, I don't want to speak out of school and state that that's what he believes, but at least initially, I see a lot of that. So again, just kind of a very initial thought on just starting to read, obviously a pretty impactful philosopher of our day. So look forward to doing some more videos and seeing where I land on it, but my initial thoughts.